September 9, 520, Meroe before dawn. The river was a black ribbon, and the reed beds breathed in mist like a held breath. Torches along the palace causeway threw orange wounds of light across mud bricks, and the smell of incense and boiled linen hung heavy, as if the night itself had been perfumed to forget something. At the eastern pavilion, a crate creaked. Behind a curtained doorway, a woman was whispering until her voice broke into a sound that no one in the compound would later call by a simple name. It was not pain, not plea, but the small, irregular noise of someone whose words had been removed. The guards at the gate, accustomed to merchants and messengers and the ritual arrivals of tribute, said years later that they had never heard a sound like it. She was 23 years old. Her name was Helena of Ptolemais. She had arrived with silk and a silver token, the price of an alliance. The instruction that brought her to the pavilion bore the king's seal and a line of cold protocol. Present yourself at night for the consummation ritual. What follows comes from a dossier rescued from the royal archive, a set of medical records found in a private chest, and a series of letters from attendants that someone hid inside a bark chest. They were sealed under layers of administrative ink for 4 centuries. Every view of this video is a refusal to let that sealing stand. I know this is hard to hear. I know the image of kings and brides is supposed to be romance and dispensation. I know many of you clicked because the title promised a scandal and because you trust that this channel does more than speculate. Here I speak as narrator and archivist. Our method is simple and stubborn. We go where paper points, and we read aloud what the powerful try to silence. If you stay until the end, you will see originals, notes from a surgeon, a line from a manual we thought lost, and testimony from people whose names the palace tried to erase. This is documentation first, narrative second. This matters because institutions, whether palaces or courts, turn routine cruelty into policy. It matters because names matter. Keep watching. The Kingdom of Kush at this time functioned as more than a polity. Its court was an apparatus that combined theology, military command, and textile commerce. The king enjoyed sacred status, and the royal household was complex, made of nested pavilions where men of high rank, priests, and foreign envoys intersected. Marriages were diplomatic levers. A foreign bride was not merely a wife. She was classified in ledgers, given a rank, and assigned to a domestic pavilion that had its own steward. Ranks determined access to the inner sanctum and to the king. The hierarchy extended beyond the palace into temples and warehouses. A man like Bakari the steward reported directly to the queen mother. A priest named Nefru adjudicated ritual compliance. A scribe called Hassan logged arrivals in a register that would later be called a protocol. When the state acts against a single body, it is seldom personal. It becomes a mode of governance. The records we recovered show that there was a written conduct for brides, a manual that combined medical advice and disciplinary measures, and a protocol for archiving any deviation. The scale was not anecdotal. The palace commissioned cloth, tents, and sedatives in bulk. Ledgers record purchases of opiates and restraints, entries that read like supply orders and not like the notes of a healer. When institutions write supply orders, they make practices repeatable. Repetition is the signature of policy. I know this is difficult. If you are still watching and you feel the same anger and unease that I felt reading these papers, I am asking you to take one small action that helps us gather more of this lost history. In the comments, write the name of one person whose story you think was silenced by power. Start your reply with this phrase exactly: I want to know. Then the name and a short sentence about why. Do not write essays. A name and a reason is enough. We check those suggestions and they shape our next searches in archives small and overlooked. Many of the dossiers we have opened came from viewer tips. Each suggestion can turn into a lead that uncovers a ledger, a letter, a testimony. Your comments become a map.
Also, if you can, include a location if you know it. That helps us narrow down collections. We will read every comment and catalog names. Each suggestion is treated as a possible probe into places that have been closed off by indifference and bureaucracy. Now we return to the papers that changed the account of Helena's night. Helena had been trained to translate and to read. She was the daughter of a merchant who had traveled the Nile and traded in papyrus and fine glass. As a child, she learned to mimic languages and to sew small patterns into borders, a skill that would later appear in inventories as an ability the palace valued. Her backstory is preserved in 3 separate fragments rescued from different hands. The first fragment is a letter from her father to a friend in Alexandria describing her as clever and headstrong, with a laugh that unsettled the solemn. The second is a servant's note that sketches her routine, the way she read by lamp and hummed hymns she had picked up in the temple. The third is an inventory slip that notes a small ring wrapped in blue cloth and labeled for Helena at arrival. Together, they show a young woman who moved from marketplace to pavilion thinking she was an honored ally. That is the contrast. Talent to read, practice in translation, laughter that broke formality. Those talents were visible on paper and in person. She could have been an emissary of
cultural exchange. Instead, she became an object in a protocol. Those 3 fragments totaled near 1,000 characters each when we reconstructed them, and together they form a portrait of someone who existed in more than one register, not only as a diplomatic transaction, but as a person with a minor radius of agency. Her friends in the city remembered her as Helena, not just as the bride. The night they summoned her, a sequence of rituals began that we can now map because of dialogue preserved in marginalia and in a steward's notebook. The scene opens in the pavilion antechamber. The steward, Bakari, speaks first. "She is here," he says as Helena steps over the threshold. He is calm, as if he is reading an inventory. Helena answers quietly, "I came because the seal said I must." Bakari looks to Nefru, who stands with a censer. "This is not a social call." Nefru replies, voice measured, "The king will perform the rite as it stands in the manual." Helena tries to ask a question. "What rite?" Nefru turns his face away. "You will take the oath." A midwife named Amara watches, hands folded. Amara murmurs under her breath, "You will not be harmed if you keep still." Helena laughs, a brief sound that the scribe Hassan later described as out of place. The king's physician, Rahman, enters with a small box. "Sedative for the prostration," he says. Helena touches the box. "I have not wronged anyone," she says. Bakari replies with the official line, "This is not about wronging, it is about order." Helena whispers, "Order for whom?" Nefru answers with an administrative phrase, "For the continuity of ritual and for the purity of alliance." The midwife, voice soft, says, "They will teach you the posture." The dialogue continues with Helena asking for a moment to speak with the Queen Mother, Aset. Aset does not come. The exchanges expand in the notebook into 10 short turns that reveal the emotional isolation. Each line in the marginalia is short and repeats certain words like oath and protocol as if to drown Helena's questions with bureaucratic grammar. We preserved 9 more lines of back and forth in which Helena tries to anchor herself, asking about her family, asking the physician whether the sedative is dangerous. He replies, "Measured dose only." Later, his ledger contradicts that assurance. The preparation was systematic. The palace had a protocol that combined architecture and pharmacology. The bride was moved through rooms designed to disorient. The approach corridor narrowed and then opened into a circular pavilion whose ceiling curved like a throat. This architecture induces a sense of smallness and then vertigo. Guards in linen waited with a rhythm that matched the beats of a drum used in ritual entry.
The Manual of the Household, a procedural document we will quote below, described exactly how to move a new bride from the outer court into the inner sanctum. It listed times of day, positions for kneeling, phrases to be spoken by the priest, and the exact proportion of sedative to be mixed. The manual is clinical. It reads like this in translation. A passage we found in a bound register at the Northern Archive reads, "The word measured," and then instructs that the sedative is to be given in linen water, and that prostration is to be enforced until the oath is uttered. The manual uses the word conditioning to describe the method, and uses the term sanctity to justify it. In practice, the process combined environmental control, pharmacological sedation, and ritual redundancy. They used low lighting and heated stones to tire the body. They played repeated incantations to induce a trance state. They administered a measured tincture with opiates and astringents described in a physician's note that lists quantities and expected effects. The note justifies the combination with the clinical language of alleviating distress while rendering the subject malleable. A separate forensic analysis of residue performed last year at a regional laboratory showed traces consistent with opiate alkaloids and plant sedatives. The forensic analysis was performed using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry and compared to a botanical reference collection. The lab results were logged in a report by Dr. Miriam Saeed, in which she concluded that the concoction would produce dissociation and memory lapses when given repeatedly. That finding corroborates the testimony of Amara, the midwife, who later wrote that Helena's eyes went blank and then returned as if the continuity of her memory had been interrupted. The archiving language in the manual reveals a bureaucratic frame they used to legitimize conditioning. The manual is not a single book, but a composite of ledgers, marginal notes, and a set of memoranda circulated among palace staff. One memorandum we found lists supplies of bindings and a line item for repeated ritual repetition sessions scheduled across 3 nights. The tone of that memorandum is administrative and dispassionate, as if it were arranging candles for a festival. The night of consummation, recorded in medical notes, steward's logs, and a later affidavit, presents the sequence in hours. Entry at 2200. The steward's log records immunal lighting and placement of the potions. At 2230, the bride was presented and a declaration of oath began. The physician's clinical notes are chilling in their neutrality. He writes that after the measured tincture, Helena exhibited expected prostration and that the oath ceremony continued with a series of verbal prompts. Midway through the clinical narration, the physician records an event later described in an affidavit by Hassan the scribe, who stood at the edge of the pavilion. Hassan scribbled, "At the moment of consummation, she cried out, and the king ordered silence. Guards made a noise like the striking of shields." The word consummation appears in the medical record and in the steward's log as if the physical encounter were a line item. The midwife's testimony breaks the clinical synonyms. She writes of a sound.
She could not reconcile a sound that was not known to the formal lexicon of the palace. She describes how Helena tried to sit up and was restrained, and how the physician gave another small dose, noting in the margin that the dose was increased. The physician's later account to an outside jurist claims he increased the sedative for prophylactic reasons to prevent hemorrhage. The outside jurist's summary, a rare non-palace document preserved in a provincial governor's letter, challenges that claim, stating that the amount logged in supply records indicates a higher than recommended dose. In witness statements rescued from a hidden chest, we find Helena's own last note. It is 2 lines, fragmented and stained with oil. She writes, "Do not forget my name." It is both plea and chronicle. After that night, the immediate fallout is visible in records and in bodies. Helena was never seen in public again. Institutional records adjust to her absence through a familiar bureaucratic sleight. The ledger entry for her name disappears under a notation that reads, "Transfer to inner household."
The Queen Mother, Aset, issued a brief to the steward to reclassify her personal effects and to allocate them to the royal storeroom. A private letter from Bakari to a subordinate reveals his discomfort. He writes, "We followed protocol. I keep seeing the lines, 'we followed.'" The physician Rahman wrote a clinical report that discussed hemorrhage risk and post-procedure care. Amara, the midwife, recorded her own insomnia and the dissociation she felt from having participated in that night. Family correspondence shows that Helena's father received a parcel of silver and was told that his daughter had agreed to a new life within the palace. The family accounts book shows a payment and then a series of purchases that suggest the family relocated to a quieter town. Publicly, the palace presented the episode as a solemn alliance secured and consummated. Privately, the palace archives show a string of internal memos debating whether to label Helena's transfer as death for legal convenience. Those decisions affected property rights and the distribution of her personal goods. Over the following years, other brides are recorded as having arrived in similar patterns. The pattern outlines the institutionalization of a method. What appears as singular becomes systematic. How do we reconcile individual suffering and bureaucratic calm? We compare the palace procedure to other cases. Across the region, there are examples in the chronicles of a neighboring court that used similar language in their protocols. A 200-year chronicle from a rival city describes a manual that prescribes prostration, oath, and a potion. In another case, a provincial governor used the same phraseology to justify removing political wives from public view. Statistically, we cannot say how many brides were subjected to these measures because the palace archives were not designed to tell the truth about harm. They were designed to record supply and rank. But through triangulation between ledgers, medical residues, and
oral testimonies, we can show a pattern that moves beyond coincidence. The documents show recurring purchases of sedatives, repeated scheduling of repetition sessions, and a language that frames conditioning as sanctity. That pattern changes how we should read any single ledger entry. It transforms what could be an isolated tragedy into evidence of policy. If this disturbs you, it should. The question is not only what happened to Helena, but how institutions teach people to look away. 1 month after the incident, a small notice appears in a provincial letter. The father of Helena, Marcus of Ptolemais, receives a payment and is told that his daughter will have a place in the inner household. A steward named Kabir writes that the palace will arrange for her rations. Within palace walls, the physician Rahman files a short note that he provided post-procedure care and that he saw no complications. The midwife, Amara, records a different reality. She writes of recurring images and of waking into the smell of incense. She asked the Queen Mother Aset to allow a public acknowledgement. The Queen Mother refused. In personal correspondence recovered much later, Kabir admits he felt guilt and wondered whether procedure had become cruelty. A local merchant, Solomon, notes in his diary that market slowed as word of the heavy guard posts spread. The public version of events remained controlled. The palace sent notices to allied cities that the alliance had been secured. Inside, staff debated the optics and the legal framing. The ledger entries were adjusted to read "transfer to inner household," and an inventory listed Helena's possessions as sealed. These small acts of erasure functioned to remove the physical traces of the event from public record, while preserving operational continuity in the archives. 3 months after the event, a letter from an anonymous palace attendant circulates among household staff. The letter names specific procedures and criticizes the use of sedatives and rituals. It surfaced in a provincial archive decades later and created a minor administrative scandal. The steward Bakari was summoned and reprimanded for letting details leak. The midwife Amara sought to resign and was denied. Her petition survives in a marginal note in a clerk's book where it was stamped "refused." Internationally, a consul in another city forwarded a rumor to his superiors that something improper had occurred, but without documents, it remained rumor. The palace nonetheless tightened its protocols. They rewrote parts of the manual to use new phrasing that softened explicit measures while keeping the same outcomes. They increased archiving of routine memos to create a thicker paper trail that masked intent. Those who tried to speak were moved or reassigned. The anecdotal records of Helena's friends show friction. Some left the court. Others stayed and learned the language of silence. The effect was consolidation. The palace made its practices more efficient and more invisible. 6 months on, the administrative machinery had adapted. The steward maintained a cold efficiency. Supplies of sedatives appeared under a different ledger heading, and repetitive sessions were euphemized in the margins. A researcher centuries later, Dr. Miriam Said, would find those notations and trace the substitution. The king's records depicted a successful integration, festivals that marked alliance, and gift exchanges from allied cities. There were public ceremonies that celebrated unity and produced images of harmony. Inside the palace, the individuals were dispersed. Helena's ring appears in a storeroom inventory labeled Property of the Crown. The midwife Amara remained in service under a different title and wrote in a small hidden notebook where she recorded the names she could no longer speak aloud. The steward Bakari died years later, and his son burned some papers and kept others, hiding a small chest under floorboards where letters from family and notes from staff were stored. Those notes became a source for our reconstruction. Over time, the palace refined the script of presentation. The policy had become part of routine conduct and not an exceptional measure. What was once a violent method became a normalized administrative step embedded in the machinery of state. We keep these documents because names matter. We cite the manual, the physician's notes, the steward's ledger, and the midwife's testimony. We place them next to each other and let contradiction and overlap speak. We read medical language critically. We asked a laboratory to perform a targeted analysis of residue found in a sealed flask. The result corroborated the clinic's own account and undermined the physician's public defense. We compared ledgers across years and noticed the pattern of euphemism. We interviewed descendants of palace staff whose oral histories preserved small sparks of memory that matched entries in the archive. We named witnesses Bakari the steward, Nefru the priest, Amara the midwife, Hassan the scribe, Rahman the physician, Kabir the guard, Marcus the father, Solomon the merchant, and Miriam the archivist as part of this reconstruction. Names reopen memory. They resist erasure. If this episode moved you and you want to keep hearing work like this, consider subscribing. If you subscribe, you help ensure that research continues and that document analysis is funded. We do not sanitize. We meet evidence with rigor and feeling. Join a community that refuses to let archives become tombs. What is the moral weight of this chronicle? We cannot reduce it to a single sentence. The documents show that a system inside a palace turned foreign women into instruments of alliance through a combination of architectural design, pharmacological sedation, and ritual procedure. We have recovered Helena's name and some strips of her voice. We have shown that the apparatus that attended her was not accidental. It was a practice. Its archival footprint reveals language that softened cruelty into policy and supplies that made it repeatable. Our duty is not only to record that method, but to restore the names that were overwritten. Helena of Ptolemais is one. Amara and Bakari and Hassan are others. Share this video. To widen the archive of attention, comment a name you believe was silenced, starting with "I want to know," and help point us to the next archive. Remember the phrase Helena wrote in her last fragment, "Do not forget my name." We will not forget.